Long Live the Misses, or Taitai Wan Sui, is one of the best Chinese film comedies of the Civil War era. With the screenplay by Eileen Chang and directed by Sang Hu, the film offers a stylish, satirical, and ironic depiction of the lives of women, of male-female relationships, and of the contemporary institution of marriage. In this module of Chinese film classics, we'll talk about this fantastic, urbane comedy in terms of history, genre, politics, and gender representations, especially the representation of women. In this video, we'll discuss the film's historical context, the artistic vision of its screenwriter Eileen Chang, and how the film depicts acts of deception, as well as of the rising and falling fortunes of one Mrs. In the next video, we'll discuss how the filmmakers adapted the screwball comedy genre, and look more closely at how some of the decisions they made about cinematic techniques such as dialogue, editing, and cinematography work together to convey a very ambivalent message about the status of women. Long Live the Misses was Eileen Chang's second screenplay. 10 years later, she would write 8 more screenplays that were produced by a Hong Kong film studio, including the comedies June Bride, 六月新娘 from 1960, and The Greatest Wedding on Earth, or 南北一家亲 from 1962. Eileen Chang, or Zhang Ailing, was a literary celebrity who rose to stardom in Shanghai during the Japanese occupation between 1937 and 1945. In the late 1940s, the Chinese press sometimes depicted her as something of a fallen woman. She had married a man who had collaborated with the Japanese and who later divorced her. And after Japan's defeat, Chang was blacklisted from publishing. She turned to writing film screenplays for a living. Long Live the Misses bears conspicuous marks of Chang's signature style, including witty dialogue, tragicomic misunderstandings between the sexes, and a bittersweet ending in which the female protagonist gets her straying man back, even though she doesn't necessarily live happily ever after. In 1947, Japan was defeated, but civil war had resumed between the nationalists and the communists, and it was unclear who would win. The era was one of military conflict and economic hardship, especially due to hyperinflation. Despite the chaos, the period from 1947 through 1952, spanning the founding of the People's Republic, is sometimes referred to as Chinese cinema's second golden age. And many of the best films from this period were comedies, including one written by Sang Hu called Phony Phoenixes, also from 1947. Several of the late 1940s comedies address contemporary social issues. An Ideal Son-in-Law, or 成龙快婿 from 1947, and Diary of a Homecoming, 还乡日记 from 1947 too, address disappointed expectations of people returning to Shanghai from the wartime capital of Chongqing. Wanderings of San Mao the Orphan, 三毛流浪记 from 1949, shows streets filled with war orphans and other poor unfortunates. Crows and Sparrows, 乌鸦与麻雀 from 1949, shows the precarious existence of urbanites trying to eke out a living during a period of hyperinflation. One of the stars of this film, who plays the homewrecker Mimi, reappears in Crows and Sparrows as the meek wife of a schoolteacher who is almost victimized by a powerful man. Let's briefly review the plot of Long Live the Misses. Chen Sizhen, a young woman from a wealthy family, is newly married and lives in the house of her husband's family in Shanghai. Her marriage to Tang Zhiyuan, who works in a bank, is humdrum, and having not yet produced a son, she feels pressure to be a good housewife and a dutiful daughter-in-law. Zhiyuan hopes to borrow money from Sizhen's eccentric father to start a business, but he's rebuffed, and so he goes with an acquaintance, Mr. Zhou, to Hong Kong in search of business opportunities. Meanwhile, Sizhen's younger brother, who's just returned from working in Taiwan, grows close to Zhiyuan's younger sister, Zhiqin. Sizhen eventually persuades her father to give Zhiyuan a loan by lying to him and saying that her in-laws have a hoard of gold bars. Once his business is up and running, the newly confident Zhiyuan falls for the seductions of a gold digger named Shi Mimi, who he met through Mr. Zhou. Shi Mimi becomes his mistress, but we learn, he doesn't, that Mimi is already married, and that her husband has been using her to scam money from men. When Zhiyuan's business partner embezzles his money and flees, all the relationships start to fall apart. The elder Tangs and the Chens start fighting. Zhiyuan blames Sizhen for having duped her father into lending him money, and he tells her that he wants a divorce, and Mimi's husband shows up at Sijun's house to extort money. He claims to be Mimi's brother and tells Sijun that Zhiyuan has gotten Mimi pregnant. Sijun sees through the ruse and counters it with a ruse of her own. She seeks out Mimi and pretends to be delighted by the pregnancy and suggests that Mimi join the family as Zhiyuan's concubine and come live with them and their newly straightened circumstances. Mimi refuses and blurts out the truth. Sijun, having saved Zhiyuan, then tells her husband that she wants a divorce. At the lawyer's office, they encounter their newly married younger siblings. And at the very last minute, Sijun has a change of heart. Sijun and Zhiyuan celebrate their reconciliation by going to a cafe where they spot none other than Shi Mimi at a nearby table plying her seductions on a new man. Long Live the Missus is set in 1947, the same year that it was made, and a few plot elements allude to present-day conditions. The old lady of the house frets that she doesn't know how much to tip a servant who has given her a birthday gift, because, as she says, the price of everything has gone up. In the next scene, the maidservant, Zhang Ma, cites the same reason in asking for a raise, prompting Sijun to agree to slip her some extra money behind the old lady's back. Sijun's father and another one of his rich pals later discuss how to convert their depreciating Chinese currency into US dollars or gold. When Mimi's husband tries to extort money for child support, he sets the price of adultery at $200 million. Then there is Sijun's younger brother who has just returned to Shanghai after 2 years in Taiwan. Taiwan had in 1945 just reverted to Chinese control after Japan's defeat, and it was common for Chinese civil servants and other workers to take up temporary assignments on the island following retrocession. He meets Zhiqin, his future wife, while buying pineapples as a birthday gift for Sijun's mother-in-law. Pineapples are a Taiwan specialty, and the young man is following Sijun's suggestion to follow the custom of giving the local product, even though, and this is continuing the film's theme of deception, he actually buys the pineapples in Shanghai. Overall, however, Long Live the Missus deals with wartime realities only obliquely, and mostly restricts its gaze to the domestic situation of two upper-class families, and the ethical dilemmas of a few individuals. Films centering on the status of women in modern society had been popular in China since the 1930s. Films such as Goddess, Daybreak, New Women, and Street Angels tended to cast women as iconic unfortunates: the prostitute, the songstress, the single mother, the frustrated professional. Long Live the Missus, made a decade and a whole war later, centers on a woman coping with pressures and expectations to conform to familial roles of dutiful daughter-in-law, childbearer, and good wife. The title character of this film is the taitai, a generic term for a wife or wives, which can also be a title or honorific, like Mrs. In social contexts like the one represented in this film, the term denotes a certain type of married woman, one who is respectably upper class or who at least has pretension to such status. 10 years after Eileen Chang wrote this screenplay, she wrote the novella Lust Caution, which was adapted into a 2007 film by Ang Lee, which begins with a group of taitai and one female secret agent sitting around a table playing mahjong in 1940s Shanghai, when the city was occupied by the Japanese. The scene, set just a few years before the story of Long Live the Missus, suggests that to be a taitai is to be prosperous, smugly domestic, and even decadent. The scenario of wives of wartime collaborators engaged in social gambling also implies that the perks of being a taitai might be obtained through insincerity, scheming, and immoral behavior. Mahjong also appears conspicuously in an early scene in Long Live the Missus. Before we see Sijun's husband, Zhiyuan, we hear about him. He has invited over Mr. and Mrs. Yang for mahjong, but he's forgotten to keep the date. Later, when he returns home late after a tryst with his mistress, he lies to Sijun that he'd been playing mahjong with Mr. Zhou. The lipstick-stained handkerchief in his pocket, as Mimi had hoped, shows Sijun otherwise. Mahjong is a game, it's a social pastime, and a form of gambling. And in this film, it seems emblematic of the risk, chance, and skill involved in the taitai's social world. We don't know who's won until the winner shows her hand. In fact, this film depicts relationships between several types of women. A maid, Zhang Ma, an old widow, old Mrs. Tang, a newlywed, Si Zhen, a young woman in love, Zhi Qin, a rich Mrs., old Mrs. Chen, and of course the other woman, Shi Mimi. The domestic environment is imperfect, even precarious. It's full of pressures, misunderstandings, negotiations, and compromises. Deception and its consequences in this domestic environment emerges as a central theme in the very first scene of the film, in which Si Zhen lies to her mother-in-law several times in an attempt to keep Mrs. Tang happy on her birthday. The maid, Zhang Ma, breaks a bowl, and Si Zhen lies to cover up this inauspicious omen. Despite Si Zhen's attempts to fob the old lady off with an explanation and hide the evidence, she eventually discovers the deception and reproaches Si Zhen. Si Zhen's compulsive lying ends up making her a pariah in her own family, as her parents and her in-laws stop trusting anything she says. Si Zhen's younger brother's oral account of his perilous airplane landing in Shanghai and his unruffled demeanor as his fellow passengers panicked is one of several instances where the film reiterates the theme of deception. Gripping tales, especially autobiographical ones, are not the most reliable. The pattern of lying and exposure repeats in later scenes, as when, for example, Si Zhen asks that Zhi Yuan lie that he will be traveling to Hong Kong by boat instead of airplane, since the old lady is afraid of planes. Again, the missus is forced to admit the truth when the old lady spots a newspaper headline saying that the ship sank. As Si Zhen is seeing Zhi Yuan off to the airport, and just before things start to go bad in their relationship, she points out to him a brooch that she wants, that she sees in the window of a store. He promises to buy it for her when he has the money. She responds, well, maybe a wireless radio would be a more useful gift instead. At the airport, we see a low-angle shot that shows the missus at her happiest moment. The brooch, which Zhi Yuan later buys for Mimi instead, at this moment represents his promise and his betrayal. When Zhi Yuan returns from his movie date with Mimi and Si Zhen finds the tickets in his pocket, she realizes what's going on. She knows that the brooch now belongs to another woman, and she puts the tickets into its case, as if into a coffin. At this point, the film seems headed towards the tragedy of an abandoned wife. But in a twist, the wife puts her deceptive skills to better use to outwit the con woman who has ensnared her man. Seeing Mimi's sham pregnancy for the extortion attempt that it is, Si Zhen plays the wife card to the fullest, suggesting that this kept woman moved from the apartment into their house to be cared for and watched over as a concubine. Calling her enemy's bluff turns out to be the right move. The other woman is forced to beat a hasty retreat. Si Zhen lives up to her name, which sounds like seems true. The missus's move duly gets rid of the mistress, but Mimi, despite her setback, remains at large. In the last scene of the film, the reunited couple is having a drink together in the cafe where Mimi first hooked Zhi Yuan. At that moment, they see Mimi pull off the same ploy with a new man. In the last shot of the film, Mimi's coquettish, smiling face fills the screen, and she gives us a conspiratorial wink. This one couple may be rescued, but the broader game of love and deception continues.